I'd like to welcome you all here this evening for this presentation on public banking. My name is Cindy Cole, and along with my husband, John Repp, we are the state coordinators for the Public Banking Institute, of which Ellen Brown is a president. As the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Seattle movement has pointed out, the 1% have a chokehold on our economic system and our political system. The street heat is great, in my opinion, maybe in yours too. But we know that it will take more than just a few demands or even a few reforms to fix our system. Paul Krugman wrote about the financial meltdown. I believe that it represents the failure of a whole model of banking, of an overgrown financial sector that did more harm than good. And David Korten, in the New Economy Working Group's publication, How to Liberate America from Wall Street Rule, advocates as one of 6 reforms the creation of a state public partnership bank in each of the 50 states. Our topic tonight is a publicly owned state bank as a step away from the Wall Street control. Ellen Brown has applied her training as a litigating attorney, researcher, and writer to the monetary field, unearthing facts that even the majority of banking and financial experts ignore. She has lived abroad in 4 developing countries and is the author of 11 books. She will be releasing another book at the end of this year focused on public banking. In The Web of Debt, her most recent book, she traces the history and evolution of the current private banking system. She shows how it has usurped the power to create money from the people themselves and how we, the people, can get it back. Ellen has written nearly 100 articles on this subject since The Web of Debt was published, and is the inspiration and thought leader behind the Public Banking Institute, where she serves as chairman and president. She has degrees from UC Berkeley and a UCLA school and the UCLA School of Law. Please welcome Ellen Brown.
Good evening. It's great to get to talk to a body of students. Of course, I want to talk about public banking and why we need them. But first, before I get to my PowerPoint, I just wanted to say I actually had to do an interview with Fox News this morning. It was like 4 minutes, but it was on the possibility of a student debt jubilee. And of course, they're totally opposed. But so what I was arguing was that it's actually quite possible and feasible. The Federal Reserve in quantitative, only the Federal Reserve can do it, because that's the only body that has the power to just create money with accounting entries. It won't cost the taxpayers a penny. Quantitative easing 1 involved $1.3 trillion of toxic mortgage-backed securities that were bought off the books of the banks, Wall Street banks, of course. Not that they deserved it, so you can argue whether the students deserve it, but hey, did Wall Street deserve it? And now they're talking about quantitative easing 4. Quantitative easing 3 sort of slipped by everybody. It was a big disappointment, and so the market wanted more. The market crashed, and so allegedly the market spoke and wanted more. And so Ben Bernanke said we can do more. We're prepared to do more. And then they didn't exactly say what, but there was a former vice president of the Federal Reserve Board wrote an article where he said that what they're talking about next is asset-backed securities. They're not going to do federal securities this time. They're going to do asset-backed securities like they did in quantitative easing 1. Well, there's now $1 trillion in student debt outstanding. It's the next crisis, and it is toxic in the sense that the students can't afford to pay this debt back, and they can't get out of it. You can't file bankruptcy. So it's a big toxic time bomb on our hands, so we have to do something about it. So what they could do is, for QE4, buy up $1 trillion in asset-backed securities backed by student loans and rip them up. And what would happen is it would not hurt the it would not inflate prices, as everybody fears. This would be $1 trillion that you're adding to the money supply, because according to the Fed's own figures, the money supply has shrunk by $3 trillion since 2008. So we need $3 trillion more out there just to put the money supply back to where it was before the Wall Street crisis. So, that's still only 1/3 of what we need. So it would be very stimulative to the economy, because what we need in the economy is demand. Like, we need consumers out there buying stuff. And who does the most buying? The young people. They buy the new homes, they buy the cars, they buy the electronics, they frequent the malls. It's the students who love to shop. I mean, the old people already, or the more mature people are. We already have what we need, more or less, pretty much. So older people and bankers and rich people and the 1%, they do not shop. They use their money for money making more money, and so that's why you have this parasitic drain off the top of the system, pulling profits out. They're not reinvesting their money into the economy. They're reinvesting it into money making money. In other words, they don't say, "Here's my dollar, give me a loaf of bread." They say, "Here's my dollar, give it back to me with more." And so it's always this mathematical unsustainability, which I'll get to. Okay, so that's my little pitch for what the Fed should do with their quantitative easing for, and how you might get out of your student debt quite neatly and cleanly. And we should have been paying for student debt we should have been paying tuition in the first place. I went to Berkeley for free. It was free I hate to reveal my age, but it was free when I went to Berkeley. And I went to UCLA Law School for $600 a year, and that was tuition. It is now $35,000 a year. This is a state school. That's $35,000 a year for in-state students, $45,000 for out-of-state. So that all of that should have been free. If we put kids all the way through high school, we should put them through college. Why do we stop at high school? And it's not an expenditure, it's an investment, as the GI Bill proved. The GI Bill was one of the most lucrative investments the government ever made. It returned 200% just in taxes. In other words, they got back twice as much in taxes as they put out there, and it returned 600% in terms of stimulating the economy. So if the government did that again, let's say with $1 trillion in waiving tuition, you could even waive the past tuition, for people who you could do it retroactively and just get that money out there. It would be a very good investment it would be good for the economy, be good for the people. It would restore the possibility of the American dream for young people who, instead of getting out of school with this huge debt burden on their backs, would actually have the possibility of getting a job and doing, science and arts and all the things that we should be investing in. So that's my pitch on the tuition. Okay, so public banking. I'm going to argue that my capsule summary is that we need public banks because all of our money today, virtually all of it, is created by banks. And we've given that sovereign power away to a private cartel. And if we want that power back, we have to have our own banks, which create money the way they do. Where does money come from? Most people think that money is created by the government. We've all seen these pictures of the printing presses, and this is the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is in fact a government agency. But the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is just the printer. The customer is the Federal Reserve, and they put in the order for the bills, and they get them for 6 cents, or roughly 6 cents a bill, no matter what the face amount is. So if it's a $100 bill, they get it for 6 cents. And they do not, they do not, contrary to these pictures you see of the helicopter flying, helicopter Ben dropping dollars on the economy, they do not give them away. They don't give them to us, and they don't give them to the government. They lend them. So even the dollars that come into existence from the Federal Reserve are lent into the economy. They're lent to other banks, which then lend them to individuals and corporations and the government, all at interest. It's not just the Federal Reserve, but all banks that create money in this way with accounting entries. There are many authorities that have said this, but one that I liked particularly well because he encapsulated it well was Robert B. Anderson, who was Treasury Secretary under Eisenhower, and he said, when a bank makes a loan, it simply adds to the borrower's deposit account in the bank by the amount of the loan. The money is not taken from anyone else's deposit. It was not previously paid into the bank by anyone. It's new money created by the bank for the use of the borrower. So this is the textbook model of how money comes into existence. It's not totally accurate, but that's like banking 201. This is banking 101. You start with your $100 deposit. You're supposed to hold back 10% if there's a 10% reserve requirement. So then you're allowed to make a $90 loan. And then that $90 will become a deposit in the borrower's account, which becomes a check, which goes into another bank. Now so that bank now has $90. It holds back $9 and writes an $81 check, which goes into the next bank, and it holds back 10%. So over 20 iterations, $100 becomes $1,000, or $10,000 in this chart from the Federal Reserve Modern Money Mechanics. $10,000 becomes $100,000. But what's interesting about this chart is that you can see that the $10,000 is still there. It never left the bank. So you never go to the bank and they say, I'm sorry, we just lent your money out to Mr. Smith. Come back in 30 years when the loan is paid off. You can always get your money because they have basically double counted the deposits, and that's how money is created. It all goes back to the goldsmiths of the 17th century. Well, in England, actually it goes back to the Italian bankers of about, it goes back a millennium with the Italian bakers, but in the British system, the English system, the goldsmiths were readmitted to England in the 17th century, and they would keep people's gold for safekeeping, and they would issue these little paper receipts that became banknotes. And everybody liked the banknotes better than the gold. I mean, they didn't want to carry around this heavy gold because it was heavy and you could steal it. So some people wanted to borrow the gold, but they too preferred the little paper receipts. So the goldsmiths early on discovered that they could lend as much as 10 times as many notes as they had gold, and nobody would notice. And so they charged interest, of course, on that. So they were multiplying their profits in this way. Although even today, I mean, all through the system, that's the way it's been, but bankers themselves will tell you they don't create money. I mean, it's so obscured what they're doing. All they were doing was just making loans when people asked for it. You know, from their point of view, they were just making a little profit here as best they could. But in fact, you can see that they were creating money. So today, virtually all of our money is created by banks. What the government creates is coins, which is $1 billion worth roughly, which is about 1/10,000th of the money supply or less. So on this chart, the bottom blue is M1, that's coins, dollar bills, and checkbook money. So coins, even if you count dollar bills as being issued by the government, which obviously is questionable, that money is only about halfway up the little blue mark. And then all of the rest, where does that come from? It comes from bank-created credit. This chart only goes up to 2006 because that's when the Fed quit reporting M3, which is that yellow block at the top. They quit reporting it because they didn't really know where to cut it off. Once they got into derivatives, it's like money and near money. You can see M2 is close substitutes. Well, derivatives are now over $250 billion dollars, or, something like $1.5 quadrillion. So the chart would, it would be too obvious what's going on if they put that in the chart. So now they stop at M2. But anyway, you can see that most, if not all, of the money, except for the coins, is created by banks. The problem with the system, money reformers will argue about this, but I'm going to say the problem with the system is the interest. Because the banks always want more money back than they put out there. And so they don't create that money. I mean, they create the principal, they don't create the interest. Where's the interest to come from? Somebody somewhere has to take out another loan to create that interest. And so what you wind up with is a pyramid scheme like this, or a Ponzi scheme. So over the last 300 years, debt has gone around the world, and we managed to trap the third world into debt. And then when that source was exhausted, when the parasites' food source globally was exhausted, they came back to the homeowners, and then when they went through their homeowners, now they're onto the students. So essentially the parasite has run out of its food source, and it's about to collapse. So what is the alternative? We actually had a sustainable system. This is the original American system, developed by the colonists sort of by accident, because they didn't have gold and silver. And so it started in 1691, which was 3 years before the Bank of England was founded. The governor of Massachusetts was fighting a little local war, and he was trying to pay his soldiers, and he couldn't find anybody to borrow the money from. So he got this idea that he would just issue these little receipts and say, these are little receipts acknowledging that you have delivered service to the colony, and then you can go out and spend those receipts and the colony acknowledges that you've done service for them, and so you're entitled to spend the receipts on goods and services. And then those little notes circulated in the community. And that system, some colonies, it was more sustainable than others. The northern colonies tended to just print, and it did become inflationary eventually. It inflated the rate, made the prices go up. But in some of the colonies, the most sustainable of the systems was the colony of Pennsylvania. It was a Quaker colony. The Quakers, like the Jews, were a discriminated against sect in England, and they couldn't go into other forms of business, and so they went into banking. But the Quaker model was a community model where it was a public bank, and the profits went back to the public, went back to the government. So Benjamin Franklin wrote about this system and popularized it, so he was called the father of paper money. But he didn't really devise it, he just wrote about it. The system was sustainable in the sense that the government could print the interest as well as so the government did create the interest along with the principal. So let's say the government created $105. They could lend $100. Then they could spend the $5 on government budget. And so you would have $105 out there. It would all come back as principal and interest. They could lend the same $100, spend the same $5, and they could do that over and over, and they wouldn't have to expand the money supply. So during that period, there were no taxes except for excise taxes on liquor. The prices did not inflate, and there was no government debt. That worked very well, but probably too well, and King George said the colonies could no longer issue new issues of money. They were getting complaints from the merchants, and when the Bank of England, it was actually Benjamin Franklin, he spoke a little too highly of the system. He went to England to defend it and said, this is working out really well for us, that this is the reason that the colonies are so abundant and things are going so well. And the Bank of England people said, that was not the point of a colony. The colony was there to serve the mother country. And so they cut off this source and made them pay their taxes in gold. And of course we didn't have gold, so we had to borrow from the British bankers who issued these little paper receipts, supposedly backed by gold. And so that put us in debt to the British bankers, and it contracted the money supply. There was a big depression, and the colonists rebelled, issued money anyway, and that was considered an act of rebellion, so that prompted the American Revolution, so it is said by some sources. So we won the war, but we lost the power to create our own money. We wound up with big war debts, and Congress was, well, it's a long story how the Bank of the British came in and counterfeited the script. So they actually printed more of this paper script than the colonists did, and it did hyperinflate and lost its value. And the founding fathers were then so afraid of the paper money that they just left it out of the Constitution. They had to come up with something rather quickly. And, there were like riots outside this little room where they were putting this all together. So, and they couldn't agree on whether to allow the Congress the power to issue paper money. So they just left it out. They didn't say who could do it. They said Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof, and that was it. And we've been arguing about that. I mean, there have been lawsuits, legal opinions about it for 200 years about what exactly that meant. So Alexander Hamilton was faced with these big debts, like particularly the French wanted to get paid in gold. They weren't going to take this paper script anyway. And so he did set up a bank like the Bank of England, which was authorized to lend money to the government backed by their gold. So the government, what gold the government had was put in this first U.S. bank, and then they issued a lot of paper receipts, supposedly backed by gold. But this allowed them to expand the money supply to many multiples of what they really had. They paid off the French, they paid off all their debts, and got the economy going, and it worked really well. The problem was that it started this spiral of debt that we're still in. I mean, a system where we have to borrow from private banks instead of issuing the money that we could be issuing ourselves, as the colonists did. So Lincoln actually went back to that system during the Civil War when, again, he was faced with huge war debts. Usurious interest rates were being charged by the Bank of England. So he was advised by one of his advisors that he could just issue money. The colonists had done it. He could do it himself. He had the power to issue U.S. notes or greenbacks, which he did, and won the war, and also did a lot of development during those 4 years. And it was an amazingly productive period where they put the railroad all the way across the country and so forth. But of course, he was assassinated, and that program was discontinued. So today we are back to banker-issued money. And one problem with it is you would have these waves of defaults and depressions and money contractions. The bankers would call in the loans and people's real estate would go into default, and then the bankers would get the real estate. So and it would cause bank panics. There'd be runs on the banks because there wasn't enough gold in the banks. And so after a particularly bad bank run in 1907, the Federal Reserve was set up to backstop these bank runs. So basically what it was this great big shell game. And because the peas weren't under the shells and people kept figuring that out, the Federal Reserve was devised to invent peas as necessary and to put them under whichever shells needed them. So it was a large fraud that was backstopped by a sort of over-fraud. So by 1934, we went through a great depression. Supposedly, the Federal Reserve was set up to prevent depressions, but obviously it didn't work because we had the biggest depression ever 20 years later. So in 1934, Robert Hemphill was credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He said, "We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve." So today, our money, the chart on the left is the federal debt. The chart on the right is the money supply. You can see they're the same thing. In fact, our debt is our money supply. And so all this concern about the federal debt and, oh, we have this horrible debt that's going to kill us is misguided, misplaced. The debt is a good thing. If we didn't have any debt, we wouldn't have any money, because private debts get paid off, and so you don't have a stable money supply. Only the public debt can grow in proportion to the GDP and stay there, so you have a stable money supply. And when that private debt shrinks, as it did after 2008, you need the public debt to grow, as it did. It went up by 50% since 2008. The only problem with the system is the interest, because the interest takes out more and more of our tax money. But if you could eliminate the interest, the debt itself is not a problem, and you can eliminate the interest if you borrow from your own central bank, which is what the Japanese do, and that's why they have a 226% debt to GDP ratio, the worst in the world, and they still have the third or fourth largest economy in the world. I mean, they're doing actually very well, not counting the tsunami, but their economy works very well considering this huge debt. The reason is the debt is to themselves. They owe it to the Bank of Japan and the Japan Post Bank, which is also publicly owned. So in order to eliminate the interest problem, you can either do interest-free banking. That's Islamic banking. It's a good theory, but they haven't. The Islamic banks, as currently practiced, are really it's called interest by another name. You know, the critics say that it's usury by another name because they're still charging a fee of some sort. Or you can have complementary currencies. This is where you eliminate the banker. So today we have all these community currencies that are basically online systems where it's just sort of a community of barter, of community exchanges. But you can't really do huge infrastructure loans or the types of things that a state could do, because you can only deal with the people within the club. If there's nobody in the club that makes steel or copper or all those cement or whatever, all those big things that you need, then you're not going to be able to do your project. Although I'm going to go too long here, but I was just in Switzerland, and there was this wonderful spa that my daughter and I went to that was built with a $3 million, well, it was 3 million Swiss francs, but they're actually worth more than $1. So say $3 million loan from the Veer Bank, which is a community currency. Well, $500,000 worth of it was in Veer, which is this community currency, interest-free. But that currency has been around so long in Germany that it's known and it's accepted. So they were able to do a $500,000 interest-free loan, and it was accepted by the workers and the suppliers. So it's quite possible. It's just that they haven't gotten that big here yet. Or the third alternative is a publicly owned bank, like the colony of Pennsylvania. If we had our own bank, we could do many things if the state had its own banks. Right now, state and local governments are borrowing at 5% or so. And the Wall Street banks are borrowing from each other at almost nothing. They're borrowing at the Fed funds rate, which is 0.2%. So if we were a bank, we too could borrow at 0.2% and cut our interest rate way, way down. The state could take its own deposits and its own capital and turn them into credit. The first thing people say when you talk about public banks, first they'll say, well, I don't trust government, and I don't want more government. And the second thing they'll say is, why do we need more banks? We have plenty of banks. But in fact, the reason we need our bank is that banks don't just take money and issue checks and make loans like people think. Banks actually create money or create credit, money in the form of credit. And if we want to take back that sovereign power, we have to have our own bank that can do that as well. So the state bank can partner with local banks to help them with their capital requirements. That's one reason businesses can't get loans today, is that the local banks can't make the loans. They don't have the capital base for it. That the regulators have increased the requirements, and so in California, I know the biggest complaint of small business, the reason they're not hiring is because they can't get the credit lines that they used to get. Nothing has changed in their business, but they, instead of an 8% credit line, they're now paying 16% on credit cards, and they can't afford that. So we could restore all of that. We now have 14 states with legislation of one form or another that's been introduced for a state-owned bank. And that's Oregon, Maryland, Hawaii, Arizona, Illinois, Massachusetts, Virginia, Louisiana, Vermont, Maine, New Mexico, Montana, and California. In California, it's my state, the legislature just, both houses passed the bill, but the governor didn't sign it. So that's where we are right now. But we're not taking that necessarily as a bad sign. He said he didn't, he had already said he was not going to have any more commissions or whatever, you know, I can't remember what the word was for it. So we heard privately that what he wants to see is a bill on his desk that's, you know, ready to go. So this gives us an opportunity to, it was a bill for a study. So now we're hoping to get a bill introduced that's actually for a bank, and we can proceed right to, at least there's enough public interest and enough public awareness of the issues now that we could go straight for the state bank. All of those states are looking at North Dakota, which is the only state that has its own bank. North Dakota is also the only state that escaped the credit crisis, totally. In fact, they've had their biggest budget surpluses ever. They've had a budget surplus every year since 2008. They've had this bank since 1919, when you saw that little movie that the farmers were in a similar situation to what we have now. They were losing their farms to the Wall Street bankers. The banks and the railroads and the granaries were all one cartel, and the granaries weren't taking their grain, and so they were losing their farms. When they realized that there was actually sort of a plot to get their farms, they banded together, formed what was called the Nonpartisan League. They're actually a very Republican red state, but to them it's not a socialist issue, it's a sovereignty issue. It's get our money back in the state and leverage it for our own purposes instead of giving it away to a foreign banking system. So North Dakota has the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest default rate, the most local banks per capita, and it hasn't lost a single bank in over 10 years, as far back as we've seen the records. The Bank of North Dakota has a captive deposit base because all of the state's revenues are by law deposited in the bank, and the state is the largest depositor. So they don't have FDIC insurance for a reason. FDIC insurance only covers $250,000, and obviously the state has a lot more money than that. So if they were part of the FDIC, they would have to, it's very expensive. They'd be paying to bail out other states, basically, and they'd be giving the FDIC the power to put them into receivership. And I mean, what if the FDIC decided they just didn't like this model? Because they are largely private banker driven. So if they saw this as competitive and decided to find some reason why they didn't like what the bank was up to, they could put it into receivership. Bank of North Dakota pays the state $30 million a year roughly in dividends, and it's 1/10 the size of Washington. So you could assume, say, a $300 million dividend. That's just the dividend. I mean, that's just the return on equity. It had a return on equity in 2010 of 19%. Compare that to CalPERS and CalSTRS, which is the California pension funds, the largest pension funds in the world. They had a return on equity of, they lost 25% and 30% in the 2 years following the 2008 collapse. The Bank of North Dakota pays a 5% on the state's deposits, which is much more than any other state is getting, like the Bank of America doesn't pay that. And I think this is the most important thing. They have or one of the most important things. They provide a direct credit line to the state, to the municipal governments. If they have an emergency, they go right to the Bank of North Dakota, and the bank it gives a loan. When they had a big flood, the bank, first of all, they froze foreclosures in the city where there was this flood, and they helped with mortgages. I mean, they helped with. They didn't need to call on FEMA or wait for FEMA. They had their emergency relief right there. It's sort of family style, and they take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. It partners with the local banks, et cetera. It guarantees a low interest rate. So consider what you could do on the same model in Washington State. The Bank of North Dakota has a population of about 1/10 Washington's. They have a deposit base of $2.7 billion in the Bank of North Dakota, and they have loans outstanding, or they have deposits per capita of $4,000, and they have loans outstanding of about the same amount. So if Washington State had $4,000 per capita in its own state bank, it could have a deposit base of $27 billion, and on the same scale, it could have loans of $26 billion. So that's $26 billion in credit that they can do whatever they want with. They can buy things or fund infrastructure. But just to show how much money you're giving away by not doing this, let's say you did the simple thing. Actually, the Bank of North Dakota used to do this, buy municipal bonds, but they later discovered there were more interesting things they could do with their money. But at one point, they did do it this way, where you could take your $26 billion in credit power, buy up that much in municipal bonds at 5%. So the interest would be $1.34 billion per year. So that's money you're just giving away. You're giving that away to Wall Street, and it's essentially free money. You're taking your deposits and your capital, and you're leveraging them into credit. And what you could do, since the debt itself is not really a problem, it's only the interest, that $1.3 billion would support $26 billion more in debt. So the state could go further in debt. I mean, there might be some sort of constitutional issue on that, but it wouldn't hurt the state at all to take on a lot more debt, because now you can service it. You know, in 2000, when everybody says, if I say that the federal debt hasn't been paid off since 1835, everybody says, well, what about when Clinton balanced the budget in 2000? Well, what balance the budget means is that you paid the interest. In other words, it's like if you paid the minimum on your credit card and you say, oh, I've balanced my budget this month. So if you service your debt, you've essentially taken care of your debt from the point of view of a state budget. Studies have shown that if you cut out interest, you reduce the cost of public projects by 50% on average. So you could fund many things that now seem unaffordable, like green energy development or public transportation, low-cost housing. There are a lot of things that if you cut the cost in half, they would suddenly be not only cost-effective, but actually profitable for the state. So a state bank can raise state revenues in several ways. Besides the dividend, let's say $300 million a year on the Bank of North Dakota model, you increase the tax base by encouraging local business, which then makes more money and hires more people they all pay more taxes. And you can reduce the borrowing costs of the state by providing a cheap credit line. Buckminster Fuller said, you never change things by creating the existing reality. To change something, create a new model that makes the old model obsolete. So if you want more information, the Public Banking Institute, that's our website, publicbankinginstitute.org, and it's got all kinds of materials like flyers and PowerPoints and lots of data and studies and where you can go to get to, if you want to help people you can contact, etc., like Cindy. And then my website is webofdebt.com.
Okay, so the concept is pretty simple. Right now, the state, we have a $32 billion biannual budget, and all of that is tax revenue collected from the people of the state. And when the state has to put its money someplace, because it used to have a big vault in the treasurer's office, but I don't think that much money would fit in the vault. So what we have is a bank account, and that bank account is called a state concentration account, and it's held at the Bank of America. So one of our favorite players, yeah, boa, like a boa constrictor, they're strangling us. So the concept is, why should we let Bank of America make money off of our money? Why don't we just create our own institution? We'll keep the money here. We make money off of our money, and then we still control that money so we can leverage it back into our communities to do the great work, as Ellen was describing how we can leverage that money. So I just want to give a quick update on where we're at with the bill and some of the principles that we're trying to follow as we're drafting this bill for the upcoming legislative session. I have a task force working on it right now. It's a blue ribbon task force authorized by Speaker Frank Chop from the 43rd District. And Frank is very supportive of this whole concept. And in fact, our whole House Democratic Caucus has been very supportive of it. And I want to acknowledge the fact that Representative Phyllis Kennedy and Representative David Frocht and Representative Luis Moscoso, who are all represented here, are all co-sponsors on the bill that passed. We had last session. In fact, that bill has gotten such good traction in the House that every member of the House Democratic Caucus leadership has signed on to the bill. So there's a good shot at it. Our task right now is to come up with something that is viable, that gets our foot in the door and really can gel the legislature, because there is a question on whether or not we may need to pass a constitutional amendment to get it there. So our strategy is to try and avoid that constitutional question, if at all possible, to get our institution up and running and to put some test things out there. I don't want to get presumptuous and get ahead of the task force. I want to respect the work of the task force because it is a blue ribbon task force. These people know what they're talking about. My only requirement in assembling the task force was that they had to be financial experts, financial institution experts, and they had to be open to the concept of a publicly owned bank for the state. So with that as the requirement, we have put together a blue ribbon panel of financial experts. And I don't want to get ahead of that by saying this is what we are going to do. I want to respect their work, respect their integrity, and hopefully we can come up to a bill that will have the consensus of the entire task force, which will make it much easier to get it through the legislature. If we're divided in a proposal next session, it just makes it difficult to get it done. So in respecting the politics of the situation, that's where we're at right now in trying to work through this process. Let me see. This must be the little clicker thingy. So it's been happening for a couple of years right now. We had our first test bill back in 2010, House Bill 3162. We got a hearing in the House Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee, and it was a very good hearing, actually, very positive. House Bill 1320 was drafted this past session, and we drafted a Senate bill, 5238. And in late January, early in session, we were able to get hearings in both the House and the Senate committees with jurisdiction, and had very good responses from the public. The public just came out and supported this thing. In the House hearing, well, actually in both hearings, we actually brought out a couple of gentlemen who are retired now from the Bank of North Dakota, but were top-level officers of the bank, and they were available to answer any questions of anybody in the legislature who was interested in this concept. So we really had a very good set of hearings. Unfortunately, we were not able to get the votes to get it out of committee in either the Senate or the House. So a little bit of time went by, but then we had a brainstorm. There was another bill that came through the legislature with an appropriate title. So we merged, see, Washington State, we don't have the same issues like Congress. Well, we do, but it's different in the sense that you can't have a bill that acts like a Christmas tree where you can hang anything onto it, right? In the state of Washington, our Constitution mandates a single subject title. So you have to, depending on how the sponsor writes, you can write the title as broad as you want to, and then it becomes a Christmas tree. But we try to keep things as narrow as possible to prevent that from happening. So, but that being said, a bill came through with a title that we could use. So we redrafted 1320 and hung it on to 2040, and I asked the chair of the Capital Budget Committee to prime sponsor that bill, and we got the bill steered away from the Business and Financial Institutions Committee and through the Capital Budget Committee instead. And so we got it passed out of the Capital Budget Committee. It made it onto the House floor calendar where it languished. Yeah, that's one of those little tricky maneuvers, right? But I thought it was pretty slick. Anyway, it languished on the House floor calendar, and it actually died at sine die, but it was not because of the bank piece. It was for a couple of issues attached to the original bill that we hung ours onto that really killed it. So, but that being said, there was so much momentum built up at that point. The House Speaker really supports this bill. And so he created the task force anyway, even though the bill had died. So that's where we're at right now, is going through that task force process. If you'd like to get on a stakeholder list for that task force, you can go to my legislative website and you can just click on a link and we'll get you on a stakeholder list and get you in the loop as this task force does its work. And the task force itself has its own separate website, which I can't remember off the top of my head, but call my office. We'll get you that information too, because then you can follow the progress of the task force directly as we're going through. So that's where we're at with the drafting of the bill for the next legislative session. A little bit of the thinking that went into this bill prior to drafting it, though. The real purpose is obvious. Let's keep our money in our state working for our state. But the subtitles to those are, jobs is, our House Democratic Caucus agrees that the number one issue facing the people of the state is jobs. There's such insecurity out there, and the best thing that we can do this upcoming legislative session is try and figure out how are we going to create jobs. Well, you need money to be able to create jobs, especially from a government perspective. This bank is not going to be a panacea by any stretch. Oh, by the way, the bill is called the Washington Investment Trust. There's a little story behind that, because even though the Speaker supports this concept of the state bank, he says people really hate banks, but they also really hate the state. So right now, so when you put the two of them together, they're really going to hate this. So he said, come up with a different name. So we came up with this real warm and fuzzy name called the Washington Investment Trust. It is the state bank, though, rest assured. So, and for me, the number one why, and I probably should have put it up there, but it's kind of an intangible thing. Why should we do this? If you look at the model of Bank of North Dakota, they're in their 92nd year or something like that, maybe 93rd year right now. And, they took baby steps. But a century later, here they are, an institution that is literally floating North Dakota. And so, and I'll get into some of the things about North Dakota and what the bank has done for them. But my vision is that 25, 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, we will have built an institution for our grandchildren, our grandchildren's children, that has amassed so much sufficient capital that we could actually survive recessions like what we're going through. It's like building, when your child is born, you try your best to create a college fund, right, and do the right thing. This is what we're doing for our children down the road, is giving them the resources to really build a state that we all hope they have one day. So that's the number one reason. But getting on down to it, if you talk to any small business owner, aside from the need more customers issue, their number one issue is access to credit right now. 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, I had a group of Mexican fruit growers from the Mexican Fruit Growers Association come into my office from Yakima. And they came in literally in tears because they said they were going to lose their farms. And the reason they were going to lose their farms was not because they were running a bad business or the fruit markets had fallen off. It was because the banks had cut off their credit. Nothing had changed in their credit rating or their credit history or their ability to produce. But to get to harvest, you've got to have a line of credit to get you through harvest. And they were cut off. So, those kinds of things are just unconscionable. The bank can act as that heat sink for tough times. So, and it can absorb the hardship, whereas we as individuals can't do it. It's us collectively absorbing the hardship. Economic development, we can use it for that, our own state bank, but we have to be careful about that because when I went to the Bank of North Dakota to visit with their president and learn more about how they operate, his take-home piece of advice to me was, you have to make sure that bankers are running the bank, not economic development people, because economic development people have never seen a project they didn't want to fund. And you've got to make sure that the institution is solvent and following good, sound banking practices. So, because we're into it for the long term. So we will. That's one of the primary things about the bill that we're drafting. In my personal priorities is to make sure that it does follow sound banking principles and that it is insulated from political pressure from elected officials. It's got to be able to run as a sound business. But that being said, the legislature can pass laws in North Dakota. What they do is they can target economic development initiatives. Say they wanted to develop their oil field. They can say, go that direction. Start targeting financing towards, and if they want to offer low-interest loans to incentivize it, what they do is they pass an appropriation to subsidize that lower interest rate. But it is a very possible reality for our bank to do that. Work with and support commercial banking systems. So in following the North Dakota model and this task force, one of our primary things is to try and stay as close to the North Dakota model as possible, because what can you say bad about it? It's a proven product, a century's worth of testing, trials and tribulations as well. So, for instance, you take that farmer. If that farmer needed $5 million to get to harvest, most community banks have lending limits or capital limitations. Say they could only lend up to $2 million. Well, that community bank, who knows that, because they're a community bank, knows that farmer is good for that loan and will pay it back once they get to harvest. That community bank will reach out to the Bank of North Dakota, and they go into what they call a participation loan. They participate and collectively, jointly, provide the $5 million of capital. So the Bank of North Dakota is giving out a loan at market rate. Bank of North Dakota is happy. The community bank is happy, not just because they completed the loan, but because they didn't have to go to their competitor to complete the loan and lose that customer. And the farmer's happy. Everybody's happy. It's a great system. That's the participation lending strategy that Bank of North Dakota follows, and that's one that we're going to try and emulate as well, hopefully down the road. There's a bunch of unique things about North Dakota. You may be all familiar with a lot of these, and Ellen covered some of them too. Lowest unemployment rate in the country, because we all rely on, we say that 75% of the new jobs that are created by small businesses. But if small businesses can't operate, there's no jobs created. North Dakota has figured out how to provide that access to credit that small businesses depend on to survive. It has one of the healthiest banking systems in the United States. Not only do they had no bank failures, and the reason they've had no bank failures is that the Bank of North Dakota, one of the things it does is act as a mini Federal Reserve to those banks. So when those banks need liquidity, their cash reserves get too low or for whatever reason, those banks go to the Bank of North Dakota, and the Bank of North Dakota keeps them afloat. So they've had no community bank failures. Meanwhile, here in Washington State, we've had 16 bank failures, I believe, since the credit crisis has started. But it also has the most decentralized bank system in the country. And by decentralized, I mean they have the most community banks per capita. So they don't have the monolithic Banks of Americas or Wells Fargo's that come in and suck up all the depositors. They have a whole bunch of community banks out there. And those are the banks that the Bank of North Dakota works with in partnership to make sure that the community banks who do know their local customers and can provide for the health of the community. I think that's an underrated recognition for North Dakota as the most decentralized bank system. They also were the only state in the country that actually had a budget surplus. The Bank of North Dakota has not only just returned money, about $500 million over the years, back to the North Dakota General Fund because it's a money-making operation, but North Dakota itself has a $1.1 billion surplus. For a small state like that, that's pretty phenomenal. So when you total up all the different things that are unique about North Dakota, the one common factor is that they have their own bank. They have smart use of their taxpayers' money to keep their local economy going.